If you want to make a square with two right triangles in it, or in quilter terms, half square triangles, the math is your finished size of your square, which in this case is 2 inches, plus 7/8 of an inch. And that gets you 2 half square triangle units out of your squares. Now, that's an exactly 2 inches when you add 7/8 of an inch. I would rather make it a little bit bigger and trim down so that I have a more accurate square. In this case, I made it just a very little bit bigger. These are 3-inch squares. So I'm going to mark on the wrong side of whichever one's the lightest usually. You can either do one line from point to point and then sew 1/4 of an inch away from that line, or use a tool like the magic wand and mark on both sides. In that case, you are marking the stitching lines. I do want to point out I am using a sandpaper board. That makes it much easier to mark because your fabric is not shifting around while you're working on it. You can buy commercially available ones, or you could just take a board and glue some fine grit sandpaper onto it. Once my lines are marked, I am going to match my 2 squares together, right sides together, and I'm going to sew my 2 lines either right on the lines if I mark them both, or again 1/4 of an inch from the center line if I only marked one line. I've sewn my 2 lines, sewing my 2 squares of fabric together, and now I'm just going to cut them apart between those lines. You can use scissors if you want to, or a rotary cutter, and if you don't keep it exactly 1/4 of an inch in there, it's not a big deal because you've already sewn it. Once I cut them apart, I am going to press toward the darker color. And here are ones that I've pressed. Now remember, I want a finished 2-inch square, so it needs to be 2.5 unfinished, and I did oversize slightly. So I'm going to trim down, and what I'm showing you here is a Bloc ruler. It has a groove in the back that rides on that seam that's pressed one direction. So this one happens to be a 5.5. It will cut all the way down from a 5.5 down to a 1 inch easily. So when I put this on, I want to make sure that my point is on the seam, because you can put it on this way, but if you cut it that way, you're going to have an odd looking square. So my point is going to be on the seam, and it just kind of will ride right there. I want to line it up and make sure that after I cut this sliver off over here, I'm still going to have some to trim on this side to the 2.5 inch mark. So once I get it lined up, and I have double checked that, I'm going to cut one side, then the other. And you don't even need to pick the ruler up. You can just twist it around and slide it back to the 2.5 inch mark right here, because it's marked the same from both ends, and trim. So there is my pretty close to perfect 2.5 unfinished half square triangle unit. Let me trim that just one more. So again, I'm putting the groove on the square, on the seam. I am putting the point lined up with my seam. I'm going to trim off 2 sides, so I want to make sure before I trim those that I have a little bit to trim on the other end, so it's extending just a little bit beyond the 2.5. Trim those 2 corners, and then again, you don't even have to pick the ruler up. If you do, you can put it back down again, that's fine. Just slide the ruler back to the 2.5 inch mark and trim your last 2 sides. Now if you feel like that is not enough to trim, I like to save as much fabric as I can, then you could have made your squares bigger. You could have made them 3 1/4. You would have a lot more to trim off then.